Welcome back to Season 5 of the True Blue Conversations podcast with your host, Adam Blum. G'day, podcasters. Before we get underway with True Blue Conversations, just wanted to give a huge shout out to our friend and sponsor, the Warrior U podcast, hosted by Bram Connolly. Bram is a former Special Forces commander, best-selling author, popular podcast host, and human optimization pioneer. He has an authentic style and the unique ability to not only motivate, but also take people on a journey of self-discovery. Through the Warrior U podcast, Bram interviews guests in a bid to explore all things human optimization, resilience, leadership, and coffee. His book, The Commando Way, a Special Forces Commander's Lessons for Life, Leadership and Success, is available now on amazon.com.au. So from Adam Blum and all of us here at True Blue Conversations, a big shout out to the Warrior U podcast, Bram Connolly, and his new book, The Commando Way, out now.
G'day, welcome back to True Blue Conversations. I'm Adam Blum. Today I'm joined by Navy veteran Jen Wittwer, and Jen's had a long and distinguished career in the Navy, and she's joined us today to talk about her career and also her post-career. Hi Jen, thanks for joining us on the show.
Hi Adam, thanks for having me.
No, it's an absolute honour and a privilege to come to your house and record with you. And so, Jen, before we get into your career in the Navy, let's go back to a young Jen Wittwer and what was life like growing up for you, and what you like at school, and do you have any brothers and sisters?
I actually do have 4 siblings. I have an older sister, and then I have a younger sister and 2 younger brothers. We're all mostly in public service roles, actually. My older sister's a teacher. There's me. My younger sister's a nurse, cardiac nurse. The older of the 2 brothers is a police inspector in Sydney with the AFP, and I have a younger brother who was in the public service. So I'm not quite sure how and why these careers eventuated, but we all seem to fall into a career of some form of public service, and I think that says maybe a little bit about perhaps our background and where we came from. So I grew up in Sydney, and initially my mother was a widow. She had been married to an Air Force officer, a pilot, Graham, and he was killed in a flying accident in 1961 when my mother was pregnant with me, and she had a little toddler, my older sister Louise, and so that was obviously a very heartbreaking event for my mother. And they were based in Point Cook in Victoria, and so she moved to Sydney. So I was brought up for the first few years of my life as with a single mum, who actually in those days, of course, there wasn't much in the way of welfare or sort of support, financial support. So she had to go and work. I do recall, as a young child, before going to school, that I'd have to go and sort of stay with this little old lady up the road who would care for me all day, every day. It probably wasn't a really fun time, but we didn't really know any different. And then when I was about 5 or 6, my mother remarried. She married a journalist, and they went on to have my younger sister and my 2 younger brothers. But in that time of sort of growing up, I guess, as a young person and a teenager, we didn't we didn't grow up in an Air Force household. And I will say too that my mother was also in the Air Force too, and of course had left when she married my father. We didn't grow up in an Air Force household or environment, but we did grow up knowing stories about my father, and we obviously spent time with my relatives, so his family, and so I guess I had this very strong sense of his service to the country. Also, we have a very long history of army officers in my mother's side of the family, going right back to World War I. So I did have this kind of story about military and service, and so I just sort of grew up in the northern suburbs of Sydney. I went to an all-girls selective high school where we had to wear a hat and gloves and blazer and stockings, and it was all very formal. And so I have to say, when I applied to join the Navy and actually got accepted and started in 1981, wasn't too much of a transition from that to the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service as it was then, with its hats and gloves and handbag and stockings. And I think that was sort of the type of career that I felt very comfortable with. The other career option that I had wanted was as a police officer, but I took the Navy as the career that I would that I anticipated that I would spend quite a long time in. At that time, of course, it was a career that was not quite common for young girls, and we're talking about like 1981. Most women at that time would finish school and go into sort of secretarial work or banking or just admin, and I thought, no, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to do something a bit more exciting. I didn't know what I was getting into. I have to tell you right now.
Yep.
I knew nothing about the Navy at that time. We were separate from the men's service, the Royal Australian Navy, but we, worked together. But I had no sense of really what that was going to look like. But certainly, in my younger years, I had led a very structured and disciplined life. The uniform thing, it just led me into this career of service, and and I've been now still with Navy, actually in a reserve capacity now, for 42 years. So
wow.
I've stuck with it for a long time, and it's had its ups and downs, but I guess we'll talk about that later.
So, just going back, so when your father was tragically killed, was legacy part of your life, or at that stage, or
it was actually, and although I guess it's hard for me to think back now as to how that was, but I do recall that we at least took advantage of the services of a legacy dentist, and I still remember, we'd travel from our little suburban home into the city in Sydney to go and see that particular dentist. But to be honest, I don't really. I was a child, and. That service we were able to use until we finished school, and then I left anyway and joined the Navy, so it didn't matter. But yeah, my mother had, I think she's expressed to me that she had reasonably good support from legacy, but it's not something that actually she talks a lot about.
And so you mentioned that you joined the Navy in 1981. What drew you to the Navy and not joining the Air Force or the Army?
Yeah, well, this is going to sound very. What's the word I'm looking for? Not conceited. But at the time, the uniforms for women in the military were not that great. The Army was wearing a uniform that looked a bit more like a airline stewardess. I think that's what we used to call them in those days. Airline hostess.
Yep.
And it was not in the normal Army green colour that they wear now. And the Navy uniform, while it was just a white dress, actually a bit akin to the bowling dresses that women wear at your local bowls club, it looked a little bit more like the men's Navy uniform, the white short sleeve shirt, for example, in summer, and in winter it was a long sleeve shirt with a tie and skirt, the same colours as the men, black and white. So I kind of figured that probably that was the right uniform for me. And I didn't really think about the Air Force, to be honest. And I didn't choose the Navy because it had ships, because in those days women did not serve on ships and did not deploy and could not fill roles in, combat or combat-related roles. So we were very, very constricted in the nature of the employment.
So for you, and it's just come to my mind, is it you didn't join the Air Force because of the tragedy of losing your father? Is that one of the reasons, you think, or?
Look, it might have unconsciously been a reason why I didn't. To be honest, I didn't even really look at what the options might have been. And I had just discarded the Army because of the way that the uniform looked. And look, again, as I said, I didn't know what I was getting into. So it probably could have been any one of the three services, and I think the outcome would have been the same.
Yep.
And look, it was also, I used to watch the lovely old movies with Frank Sinatra, and he'd play, in Ships Ahoy, he'd play a young sailor, and I think, oh my gosh, those sailors are so cute. So maybe it was just something like that. I don't know, but yeah.
So going in the Navy, you mentioned that you didn't know what you were getting yourself into, but you were going in the early 80s. It was a really, and from what I've been told from my parents and other veterans as well that I've had on the podcast, that women were seen but not heard in joining the forces. And was that a hard thing for you to go, well, no, I'm going to be counted here. And did it deter you at all, or did it just sort of make you go, I'm going to create and I'm going to carve my own path out here?
Yeah. I would have to say that actually I was never one to be seen and not heard, and I was always getting into trouble as a young officer. And I suppose part of that was just in rebellion to the sort of the circumstances that existed at the time. There were structural barriers, so it wasn't so much necessarily just the attitude of men in the Navy towards women, but actually sort of, as I said, those structural barriers around the roles that we could have, or the fact that we couldn't deploy and those sorts of things. So I remember sort of being a young officer and thinking, look, I took the logistics trade because I thought at least that would be something where I'd get some qualifications and maybe I could use it when I eventually left the Navy. So I felt that I had a career that was the same as the men in terms of training, and in terms of posting opportunities on shore bases, because of course we didn't go to sea. Not so much in terms of promotion, because we were in two separate services, and that was the case until 1984 when the Sex Discrimination Act came in. Mm-hmm. And at that point, the two services, the women's service and the men's service in the Army, Navy and Air Force were combined. So women transferred into the Royal Australian Navy. And that actually created quite a lot of problems in terms of men's resistance to having women, come into their space. And of course, as you know, it took, 20, 30 years later, there's still the same resistance to women going into the submarine space and, into the diving space, which they are now. And of course, probably in my mother's time, there was resistance to her being in there because it's a man's world, and men do all the hard work and the more exciting jobs, and that was the case. But I looked at it and thought, this is something that I've now started. I've done my training. It's logistics. I can do my logistics. It's not difficult, and I think that I can forge a career here of some description. Mm-hmm. But I don't think at that point I really knew what it was going to look like. There were difficulties with harassment and bullying. For women, it was mainly men who perpetrated bullying and harassment and sexual harassment. And that was something that a lot of women weren't able to deal with and left, and I don't judge them for leaving the service because of it. From reading my book that I experienced some severe forms of abuse. But I was determined to actually push past that and almost give them the finger, although back in those days I wouldn't have given them the finger. In fact, I'm not even sure if I knew what giving the finger was, but you know what I mean? Like that sort of like that defiance.
Dogged determination. Yeah,
dogged determination to say, you're not going to force me out of this career. I deserve to be here. Mm-hmm. I'm smart, I'm educated, I've been trained to do my job, and there's no reason why I shouldn't be here. And if you feel inadequate because you now see yourself in competition with me for promotion, well, that's on you, not me, right? And so I just thought, I'm gonna stick this out. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to do that was because of what had happened to me in maybe at least the first 10 years when I was a young officer, impressionable. At times, you'd think about leaving, but, you don't and you keep going, was that I thought, well, I actually want to stay and be part of any change that's going to happen in this organisation that's going to benefit women and men, that makes it a much safer place to be, a much more inclusive place to be, and where women do not have to go through the kind of experiences that I've had. And I don't know where that doggedness came from or that resilience. Maybe it came from my father, but of course I didn't know him, so I don't know. But it was those thoughts of, well, that actually gave me strength. The fact that I thought about having the courage and the resilience to keep going gave me the strength to continue. And also, in my book, I experienced bullying when I had been in the Navy 15 years and I was a lieutenant commander on a ship. And it was, it's like, and almost like, well, hang on, it's the 1990s. You can't treat me like that, right?
Yep.
But so there were still sort of these negative experiences that occurred over time. I guess by the time I'd done about 20 years and I was a commander, that started to wane a bit, and I think, the tide was turning in the 2000s. Work was being done on cultural reform, really thinking about the way we were treating people in the workplace, and I got to be a part of that journey.
Yep.
And I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about some of those roles, but that was an opportunity for me to start not only being part of the change that I had so much wanted to be, to help other women, but also as a commander being in a position to influence senior officers on what I thought needed to be done to enable that safe and inclusive workplace for women and men.
Yep, absolutely. And before we get into that, what do you remember of your time at Naval College, and where was Naval College at that time when you joined in 1981?
Yeah, 1981, the Royal Australian Naval College was and still is based at Jervis Bay, which is an ACT, it's an Australian Capital Territory area. Beautiful spot, like best pristine white beaches, the best in the world. And lots of kangaroos, and obviously a fantastic place to be doing 9 or 10 months of training that we were there for. Look, I turned up along with my fellow classmates, and so I guess explain a little bit about what the Naval College looked like at that time. It was primarily made up of midshipmen men who were there for 2 years doing a Diploma of Applied Science, and they were general entry. And that was the way that they were then recruited into the Navy as young officers. They would do their diploma and then move on to the various careers that they would have. Concurrently with that was also a degree program offered to engineers at the University of New South Wales, but they would come down to the Naval College to do their military training, also only open to men. And then you had a third option, which was what we used to call the supplementary list, essentially short service commissioned officers who might be, ex-sailors, older entrants, or people like me who came straight from school, so not degree qualified. And we would come in and do our 9 months training at the Naval College and then go off and start doing our work, jobs, whatever. So we were always considered by the male midshipmen at the Naval College to be this separate group to start with. And within that group, it was only ever 8 women, generally in a class of 40. So here we were, 2 classes a year of the supplementary list midshipmen. So only ever 16 women at one time, in a year, but 8 girls at any one time, in a college full of probably about 200 16 to 18-year-olds.
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
Men, males. And so that was a bit of a shock to me, coming from, an all-girls high school into that environment. But I actually remember getting off the train from Sydney, getting onto this blue bus that rattled all its way down to Jervis Bay, and we'd been joined at the station by these 2 young midshipmen, and I thought, oh, they must be officers. Turned out they were only midshipmen, but that's okay. We sort of get off the bus at the Naval College and get directed to our accommodation, and then, the next few days we get our uniforms and all sorts of things. And so we're all a bit not starstruck, but sort of kind of just still trying to get our, bearings and really, I guess, get some idea of what this Naval College was all about. Like I said, I had joined without really any preconceptions at all about what I was going into, or even what the training involved, or even what the end result might be. And it was not an easy time either. So, as I said, you could imagine 200-odd young men and 8 women. There was also harassment and intimidation, and it was an uncomfortable time. My classmates were great, but it was dealing with this other cohort of, general entry midshipmen, which wasn't easy. And I have to say, as we talked about, in our discussion before this podcast, hashtag not all men. And so they were not all bad. And so I've made some good friends in that time, and some, who are still friends and even mentors to me up, to this day. Yep. And I value their friendship and their mentorship. But yeah, so that was a difficult time. But one of the things that really stands out for me, or the sort of funny stories I share, is that midshipmen used to double around the Naval College, and you probably know what doubling is, but doubling is kind of not walking and not running, but somewhere in between, and in squad. Yep. And up until our class, the women of the supplementary list classes didn't have to double. For obvious reasons, it was a bit awkward in a dress and stockings and and shoes. But anyway, we were the first class where they decided that they didn't want the women just, wandering around. We would have to double as well too. And, quite frankly, as I said, we just did not have the uniforms that were conducive to that kind of activity. Yep. So that was just sort of one example where it was, I guess the environment and the attitude of some of the people there was difficult. On the other hand, the training we got was great. We had some fantastic instructors, mostly all men. But we learnt about navigation, the rules of the road at sea, navigating by the stars and navigating with instruments, learning how to eat properly with manners and knives and forks and things like that, the things that were very important back in those days. So look, it was 9 months. So it was an interesting time, but I was pretty happy to graduate and leave.
So what did you learn about yourself, Jen, that you didn't know before you went into the Naval College?
Well, I think I learned that I could manage things on my own. To be honest, I left home, as I had said to you before, that there were some issues, I guess, around my family life, and I left home essentially at 19 and never went back. And I didn't look back either. I just joined and I went, and I thought, I have to do this on my own. And I'm not sure if I ever felt that I could do that. Like when I was at school, I guess I had the protection of my home and my family and, a mum and a dad and siblings. But I didn't feel frightened about going out on my own. And again, I think it comes back to that resilience and that strength and courage that I talk about, that maybe came from my father, but who knows. And to some extent my mother as well too. She had some sort of not very nice experiences in her life and had survived them, and so maybe that's all come through in genetics and nurture and nature and whatever. But what did I learn about myself? I think it really was that I thought I can stand on my own 2 feet here. That I'm not going to be dependent on anyone, whether it be my family, whether it be a spouse eventually. Nobody. This was me, and I'm going to have to look after myself, and I'm going to have to forge my career, particularly in this man's world, which it really was back then. And I don't think anybody can argue with me about that, and I hope they don't, but that's how it felt to me as a young 19-year-old. But I had to stand on my own 2 feet, and I did.
Oh, definitely. And I think, I've been lucky enough to read your book, and I've been lucky enough to read your bio, and absolutely, you absolutely did stand on your own 2 feet. And I guess in that sense, for you, Jen, there was no turning back. Like, you'd made this decision, and this is it. I've got to this is the path now. And you wanted to, as you say, you wanted to prove yourself in this world of, I can make it on my own. And for you, as you said, getting out of college was, you were great to learn what you had to learn, and great to pass out, fantastic, great day. But where was your first posting after you finished Naval College?
Funnily enough, it was remaining in the Nowra area, and I sort of somehow moved between HMAS Albatross, which was the air station, and HMAS Creswell, which was the base that housed the Naval College. So as a young sub-lieutenant, I spent 2 or 3 years, I think, between those two bases doing basic logistics jobs, stores, and pay.
Was that an exciting time for you learning that side of things, or were you sort of chomping at the bit to get your next challenge, and explain to me that part of your career? Yeah,
so this was still before the Sex Discrimination Act had come in. So we're talking about, 1980. Well, in 1982, actually, I went to HMAS Cerberus, which is down in Western Port Victoria, to do my logistics course. But after that, I came back to the Nowra area. And so it was 83, 84, still very conscious that I was, one of a very rare breed in the base, one of a handful of women. And I'm talking about, very few sailors, because at that time we didn't have sailors women sailors in the technical categories. We had very few officers. So we stood out. And so there was still these issues around sort of sexual harassment. and intimidation. But I thought, I'm just going to get on with my job. Honestly, this is what I'm here for. And I'm a bit like you. I don't care what people think of me. I always felt like a bit like a square peg in a round hole. Like I said, always getting into trouble as a young officer. But they were all learning experiences, and I'm grateful for them. And I just got on with the job, and I wanted to be, logistics officer, and I wanted to show people I could be a logistics officer. And to be honest, the people that I worked with in the pay office or in the stores area, I don't remember ever feeling that I was not meant to be there. I think once you find your tribe, for me, obviously the logistics branch, and, at one stage I was working with the stewards in the officers' mess, or I was working in the stores section with the stores sailors, or in the pay office with the writers. You kind of look after your own. So I never felt uncomfortable or that it was not a safe place to be. And I think that's just what I just kept focused on.
So you mentioned the Sex Discrimination Act in 1984. For people who aren't aware, Jen, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, but can you explain when that came in and how was that received across the Navy in that time, and how did it change and open up opportunities for you and people coming after you, women coming after you?
Yeah. So what it did essentially for the military was that it actually required the military to do away with the women's services and only have that one service. So the Royal Australian Navy, the Australian Army, and the Royal Australian Air Force, or Air Force as they call themselves now. And so I think that was the biggest change. And so my perception of the way men viewed it at that time was that, oh no, we're going to have, all these women coming into our service. Now we're going to have to compete with them in certain trades, because obviously we didn't have women in the combat or combat-related roles. So in logistics, for example, now we could be competing with women for promotion, as though we were some alien force, as opposed to maybe just another group of men. I couldn't understand or comprehend why they had such difficulty with it, or even that they didn't think that women were capable or could even do those jobs. The Sex Discrimination Act, though, so because of what it did for Australian society, was that it created a platform of equality for men and women in terms of, particularly in work and in public life. But for the military, it wasn't ready to have women in combat or combat-related roles. So caveats were put in place that still restricted women from taking up roles in those, pilot and tank driver and armoured corps and infantry and, being a rifleman or Navy diver, none of that, or even pilot, that doesn't actually require a lot of physical strength in the normal sense. None of those roles were open to women. And I think that I'm not sure, it didn't affect me in any way, because I was logistics and that had been open to women anyway without any detriment or any issue. But from there, those caveats were not lifted until the early 1990s for combat-related roles, and then 2011 for combat roles. So we're only talking 12 years since the last restrictions were lifted. So the Sex Discrimination Act was quite a significant event, but not for women in the military. We were still very much constrained about what we could do.
So was that including being posted on ships? And how long into the future did you have to wait to be posted to a ship? Yeah.
So as part of our training at the Naval College, we were able to participate in a 6-week training cruise on a ship called HMAS Jarvis Bay, which was an old maritime force ship of some description, cargo ship of some description, that had been painted grey, and all of a sudden it was a training ship. And so we would go, our class would go to this ship for 6 weeks, and we'd do a little bit of basic navigation, and we'd learn about being at sea. Not that was ever, not that we women ever thought that was going to be an option for us. But the funny thing was that during our time on our 6-week deployment, there was, I can't recall now what the issues were, but there was some problem with the civil unrest in Vanuatu. And the Australian government decided to send over our ship to Vanuatu to pick up any Australians that needed to come home. Well, because women could not leave Australian waters on an Australian warship, we were taken off the ship in Townsville, and the ship sailed off with our male classmates, and we women were, had to, just go off and do something else. I can't even remember what we did or where we went.
Yeah, right.
But we could not deploy. And also, of course, we didn't have the uniforms for serving on a ship either, so we were given the men's uniforms to wear, which is pretty much sort of signified my entire naval career wearing men's uniforms. But so that was a kind of an interesting example of how strict they were, how strict the government and the Australian military was about where women could or couldn't go. It wasn't until the early 90s when they lifted the restrictions on combat-related roles, which meant that they, for example, opened up the technical categories so we could start to, bring women into a lot more of the technical roles, like, engineers of ships, for example, pilots, those sorts of things. There had been one or two instances in the 1980s where women had been allowed to join a warship for short periods of time, but not for like a normal posting. And that sort of really didn't start till the early 1990s. So for me, it got to a point in the early 1990s, I'd been promoted to lieutenant commander, so that's sort of mid-seniority level officer, where because they'd lifted those restrictions, I was then told that if I wanted to get promoted to commander, I would actually have to do what they call a charge supply job, charge being you're in charge of the whole supply department of a ship. So eventually that came about. And look, I was excited. I was married, but I didn't have children. I thought there's no reason why I can't go and do this. I have to do it. At the same time, there was some trepidation because, I hadn't had the benefit of being a junior officer on a ship and learning the ropes, making mistakes as a junior officer. And here I was going as a senior officer, senior member of the command team, in charge of the supply department. I was also the helo control officer, so a bit like being an air traffic control officer on a ship, and also the nuclear, biological and chemical defence officer. So these were extraneous duties and responsibilities that I had to do as the logistics officer, and people expected me to know what I was doing.
It's a lot of pressure.
Exactly, right? And
setting you up to fail.
It had. There were a couple of women logistics officers who had gone to sea before me who had not succeeded. And of course, when something like that happens, and you think, oh, well, see, we shouldn't put women on ships at sea because they can't hack it or they can't do it or whatever. But it was very unfair because we'd not had the benefit of that experience as young officers. And we were expected to be able to do the role of a senior officer of the ship and give the sailors confidence in their command team. But I thought, like I thought when I was a young midshipman, that I'm, okay, I might not really know how to do it, but I'm going to do it. And I say that in my book, like you get offered this opportunity, take it even if you don't know how to do it.
Bite off more than you can chew and just chew like crazy
exactly,
and keep going.
Right, right. And I went and did the training I had to do to be the helo control officer and the NBCD officer. And, eventually I joined my ship HMAS Swan in 1996. Look, it was certainly an experience, and I look back on it with pride because I did it. I was only on the ship for 12 months and then it was decommissioned. But I was part of the decommissioning crew as well, and so decommissioning from a logistics perspective is quite a big job. In fact, it's the biggest job of any decommissioning of any department on the ship. We had our ups and downs, but all in all, it certainly gave me a better understanding of who I was and who I could be. I not only had to sort of really cope with feelings of imposter syndrome, which we all get, about maybe I shouldn't be here, I'm not good enough, all those things that you have. But also I also had to put up with some bullying and harassment that occurred on the ship from a peer, from a colleague, from another senior officer on the ship, which was so totally unacceptable. But by that stage, I really was at a point where I was just saying, I'm dealing with this. This is not going to happen to me. I deserve better. I reported him. I got it sorted, and it was done and dusted. But it should never have happened.
No.
And this was the mid-1990s, and I can remember thinking, this is the mid-1990s. You can't treat women like that. Anyway, cut a long story short, it was one of the best things I ever did. It was difficult and it was hard and uncomfortable at times, but I enjoyed the respect of the sailors. I think I ran a good department. We never had any problems. Again, the tribe looking after each other. And I left with very fond memories of that experience. But that's the only sea posting I've had, because then I got promoted to commander. Mm-hmm. Then I had my first child in 1997 and went to be the charge supply officer at the Australian Defence Force Academy. So another charge supply job, which professionally and in terms of professional development was entirely appropriate. So I'd kind of, by the time I'd finished that job and had my second child in 2000, I'd done the two key charge roles that I needed to do to be competitive for further promotion from a logistics perspective. And then, of course, by the time I had my children and they were starting school and things like that, I thought, well, I don't want to go back to sea. And to be honest, actually, I'm not even sure I still want to be a logistics officer. And so in 2003, I took a step back and transferred to the reserves for 5 years so I could, spend more time with my children at school. But I took up a reserve posting that actually was almost like a full-time job, and I did that for 5 years before I then came back to full-time service in 2008.
Well, I want to just go back to the mid-80s where you were actually, you've got the... Oh, it's a highlight of your career as well, where you actually went and walked Kokoda. And can you explain to us how this came about?
Certainly. So I was back working at the Naval College in 1985, 86. And every year the college used to conduct adventure training for those general list midshipmen who were there all year for 2 years. And one of those adventure training activities was the Kokoda Trail. Or Kokoda Trek. And at the time, I was a sub-lieutenant. I used to play volleyball. I ran. I did cross-country. I was quite fit. And they called for staff to take the midshipmen across. They needed about half a dozen staff, officers and senior NCOs, senior sailors, to accompany the midshipmen on this trek. So I thought, well, I want to do that. And all of a sudden it was like, oh no, you can't do that, you're a woman, because no woman had done it before. And I do want to say that at this time, the only people who could do the Kokoda Trek were military, Australian military. It wasn't open to the public or commercialised like it is now. And, if that's a good thing or bad thing, I'm not going to comment on that. But at the time, only military folk could do the trek. But I actually didn't put my hand up to say, oh, look, I want to be the first woman to do it, or I want to do it because a woman hasn't done it. I just put my hand up because I thought, I'm on the staff, I'm fit, I want to go and do it. It's just another physical activity almost. Anyway, thankfully, the male lieutenant who was in charge of, putting this team together said, well, if you can pass the fitness test like we all have to, then there's no problem with you coming. So... no problem, pass the fitness test, do all our training and everything else, and off we go. There were some minor hiccups along the way, only in so much as at that time the Papua New Guinea Defence Force was not open to women, so we stayed either end of the trek, we stayed at Tarama Barracks, and very little privacy, in terms of showers and bathrooms and things like that. But no problem, I managed all that. I thought... I'll just be careful. Got a little bit of kickback from a couple of the young midshipmen who still thought a woman shouldn't be there. But the telling point was one particular midshipman who I can't even remember his name now, doesn't matter, but he gave me a lot of grief about being there. even though, I was walking the trek at the same pace as everybody else, there was, I don't even know what his issue was. And also I was senior to him in rank, so I'm not even sure he was allowed to have an issue, but he did. And we all got sick, right? At some stage, we all got sick. We were all vomiting and had diarrhea, and that's just par for the course when you do something like that. And he got sick and allowed... I still recall this fantastic senior sailor we had with us. He was a PTI. We used to call him Moose because he was built like one. He carried this midshipman's pack along with his own, and the midshipman let him. And then a few days later, when I was sick, and vomiting and diarrhea all at the same time, and, in the morning I got up and got on with it, put my pack on and just kept going. And I thought, I'm not going to be like that male midshipman was, right? Yes, it's not pleasant. It's not easy to walk when you're sick. You've probably got a fever and it's very uncomfortable and you're dehydrated. But I'm not going to expect someone else to carry my load. And I think using that as a metaphor, actually, probably I've done that my entire career. No one else is going to carry my load but me, right? And so I had the dubious honour of being the first woman in the military to do that trek, but I didn't do it because I wanted to be the first woman. I just wanted to do it. And I didn't understand why people were, resistant to that idea. And that was probably the first time I felt I really experienced some discrimination, to be honest, even though there was structural discrimination in place before that. This was active discrimination based on people's attitudes and beliefs. Fortunately, I had good support. And I would say throughout my career where there has been pushback and resistance to some of the things that I've done, that I have had good support from the senior male officers that I have worked for. And I've never worked for a woman. So all my bosses have been men.
Yeah, right.
And in the main, most of them have been terrific leaders and mentors and men that I'm proud to have served under. But I didn't have a role model. For me, it was about fumbling through this career. And yes, having a whole lot of firsts because it just happened to be the time when things were changing. And somebody had to put their hand up and do it because, if not me, who? And if not now, when?
And I think going back to Kokoda, where you were experiencing pretty similar to what the men experienced apart from being shot at, diarrhea, vomiting, fever, and for you, looking back now, was it a proud moment when you actually completed that trek and stood and saw those 4 pillars, and what was that like for you?
Yeah, I think it's probably the first time in my military career where I had really had potentially experienced what our soldiers had experienced in World War II in their journey on that trek. And it really made me reflect on what service meant. Like I said, when I joined the Navy, I didn't really know what I was getting into or what I really thought I was going to be doing. But that was the first point where I thought, I'm proud of the fact that I'm in the Navy. I'm proud of my parents being in the Air Force. This military service thing might have something to it. And, I guess just sort of sitting there and reflecting on what they must have gone through. Yes, being sick and being shot at the same time, or wondering if they're going to get shot in the back as they're climbing up, the mountain or the hill, in that sort of terrain where actually the Japanese turned back because it was too difficult for them. But at the same time, they've got to protect themselves and stay alive. All of that, comprehending all of that is just, I guess that's why people do the trek now, because it does give you that sense of understanding and service of our military forefathers, what they've been through, and foremothers, I should say, too.
Absolutely. And I think for you too, I guess a new sense of, hey, I've just gone through absolute hell. I can go through anything. Like what I've experienced here, I can go, if I can experience this and overcome those challenges that you were faced, it's a pretty good platform to launch yourself into further, what you would do in the rest of your career. And I'm a little bit jealous of you because I was supposed to do Kokoda this year, and unfortunately, due to medical reasons, I had to pull off and let one of my Army veteran mates do it himself. And I asked him when he got back, and I said, what was it like? And he said, brother, it's a different experience. He said, I'm grateful I've done it. And he said, I've come back in a sense that what I've faced over there and the challenges, it's nothing to what I can face it in life. And I think you came back with a similar sense of, hey, I've accomplished something that's pretty, it's pretty enduring in its own right, of 96 kilometres of up and down. And like you say, Jen, you can't turn back. Like there's no, you're walking from down the bottom. You just got to keep going to get to the end. And that's exactly what you did.
I think what I really took from it was that it made me realise that I am capable.
Absolutely.
Right? That I could meet any of these challenges that were going to come across my paths. It also taught me a lot about human nature, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And when people are under stress, physically and emotionally and mentally, they do exhibit behaviours sometimes that are not healthy or good or pleasant. And so you're dealing with all of those. And I think it really set me up really well for the things that were to come.
Absolutely. And I want to go forward to, and I asked this in all my podcasts, of 9/11. Where were you on that day, and what do you remember of that day? And did you think that we would be dragged into a global war that would last for 20 years and you would end up serving in Afghanistan in 2013? Where were you on that day?
Right. To be honest, I can't remember specifically where I was on that day, but I do have a story, and that is that around about that time, there had been reports of inappropriate and unacceptable behaviour by sailors in international ports on our ships. And I was, subsequent to 9/11, and then thinking, of course, a horrific thing that had happened, I don't think I necessarily thought that it impacted me right then and there, but only a couple of months later, I was put into a team that had been put together to go across to Diego Garcia and Bahrain to interview various personnel at both places about these allegations of behaviour. And I can remember thinking, 9/11's just happened. I don't want to fly anywhere. And I'm sure probably most people felt that way, right? It was scary to think, we'd been terribly lax about, aircraft security and airport security up until that point, or even our own national security at our bases and headquarters. Here I was having to fly directly to Diego Garcia via a multitude of different aircraft and owned by Australian and American military. Of course, fully trusting the capability of our pilots, no problem, but just the sense of, having to fly somewhere and be in aircraft. And we had to use some civilian aircraft as well too. So that kind of frightened me a little bit, to be honest. There's been a couple of times in my career I've been frightened. That was one of them. But of course, no, I did the Kokoda Trek. I can go to Diego Garcia and I can do this. And so, so we got on and did it. And, of course, there were no problems. But yes, and so I did not realise at that point that would lead into a 20-year, operation in Afghanistan that would ultimately provide me with the opportunity to deploy there. I never thought that I would ever get an opportunity to deploy at all, but I had deployed on my ship. We had done a couple of deployments around Southeast Asia. That's not the same as a land deployment. And so in 2012, when an opportunity came up to have someone from the Australian military deploy to Afghanistan as a gender advisor to NATO, not as part of the Australian force, that was me. Then it was selected to go. But in terms of the frightening, I'll just tell the story about the second time I've been most frightened, and I guess maybe apart from giving birth, because that's frightening in itself, was in Afghanistan. I was based at the operational command at the airport, Kabul International Airport, and once a week I had to drive into the Green Square in Kabul City, where the headquarters were, for various meetings and gender advisor meetings and so on. And on this particular occasion, I was in a convoy of 2 NATO vehicles. The arrangement there was that normally there would be a driver and a co-driver usually of maybe corporal rank from, one of the coalition forces. We'd have to have both our weapons with us, so 9mm and the Ostire weapon, and all our PPE on and so on. And we were coming, so we're probably about halfway to the green square, the green zone, and we were going past a small NATO base that was actually manned by Afghan security forces, and there had been attacks on Afghan security forces as well as NATO forces. And all of a sudden, there were two vehicles in front of us that kind of, and there's no lanes on their roads in Kabul, but they kind of just veered towards each other and created this V neck. And we were blocked. So our two vehicles were blocked. And, your first thought is, oh, well, this is a deliberate attempt to, bomb the NATO convoy, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then and it's outside a base, so you kind of think, oh, well, then it's going to take out the Afghan security guards, it's going to take out us. These two guys get out of their car and they start having a bit of a stoush, and one guy gets out with a long pipe, and the corporal who was driving my vehicle just said, I'm going to give them 30 seconds, and if they don't move, I'm going to push through. But within that 30 seconds, they did get back in their car. It was just a road rage incident, and we moved on. But I have to tell you, of course,
time probably slowed at that point.
Yeah, and of course, no one wants to die on deployment, and I feel very deeply for the families of those who have lost people there. But sitting in this car thinking, selfishly, I was thinking, I'm just a gender advisor. I'm not a soldier. I'm here helping the Afghan security forces. I'm a mum and I want to get home to my kids. They were the first things that went through my mind. And I'm sure that's probably the case for all people who have faced similar kind of situations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But, so those are probably the most frightening experiences I've had.
And what were your first thoughts of when you got into country in Afghanistan? And because you were in Kabul, so you didn't actually get to Tarin Kowt, did you? You were just based in Kabul?
Yeah, because the security situation in 2013 didn't allow for any movement unless it was absolutely necessary. So I didn't even get an opportunity to go out to, to our operating bases to meet with other gender advisors and gender focal points. We had to do all our courses, all our, conversations or by email or phone call, because we didn't really have Zoom back then. So I could only meet with colleagues who might come into the Kabul city flying from, Tarin Kowt or Kandahar or other, operational bases, other forces, gender advisors who might come in that respect. So it was kind of limited in our ability to really get out and connect with people who were trying to make a difference in terms of the lives of women and girls in that country. But it was still for me an awesome experience. And awesome is the only way to describe it. I mean, I think people get a lot out of deployments. They learn a lot again about themselves, what they're capable of, what they're sent to do. It's dangerous. It's really important work. As I said, at that time, the International Security Assistance Force was there to support the reconstruction and assisting the Afghan security forces, developing them, training and mentoring and advising and assisting. And so that was our primary focus. And so I, in my role as a gender advisor, which is not a woman's advisor, and it's not there specifically to focus on women, but it is to enable the operational commands to understand that they need to think about the gender perspective of the things that they do. And part of that, in their support for the Afghan security forces and training, is to understand that that they wanted to grow their women cadre as well, like we all do. Like we're always, the ADF has been working hard for 10 years to increase the numbers of women. Yep. The Afghan security forces were doing that as well. And so, had an opportunity to meet and speak with Afghan women who are police officers and army officers, talk to them about their, what issues they were facing in terms of their employment. Similar story to, mine when I joined in 1981, actually. Similar kind of issues that they face now, childcare and things like that. But, it was so rewarding to actually, and that's where I think probably I really it started my journey working in the gender and women, peace and security space. I realised that while I had and enjoyed a certain level of gender equality here in Australia, that there were women around the world who were not experiencing that. And Afghanistan was a great example of where women had been left behind for a long time. Of course, we got to them to a certain point under the NATO operation, and then, of course, with the Taliban coming back a couple of years ago, now everything that we had gained has been completely lost. And I feel for my Afghan sisters in that regard, that especially those who were in the army and the police who wanted to do something to help reconstruct their country and bring stability and peace. Now that's been taken away from them completely. So I guess for me, in terms of my career moving forward, it's set the groundwork for me in terms of thinking, you know, while I always only ever wanted to help women in my Navy and in my military not experience the things that I'd experienced and sort of be part of cultural reform, which I was, here I had now had an opportunity to think more globally, like bigger picture. Like, you know, there are other armed forces and police forces who need to do that as well too. They want to increase their numbers of women. They want to open up more roles. They want to remove the discriminatory practices that have existed for a long time. And so it was really Afghanistan, I think, that sort of, you know, once I'd finished my work in the ADF in 2018, that I made the decision to leave full-time service and continue to work for the UN in a sort of a consultant capacity to continue working with the security sector on gender mainstreaming, so increasing women's participation, helping them understand how to apply a gender perspective in operations, all the important work that needs to be done to bring gender equality up in the world, which of course is a sustainable development goal of the United Nations.
Well, it's a passion for you that you've absolutely gone on, and now that's what you do now. But I want to go back to, there's a proud day for you where in 2014, and that's, you were awarded your Conspicuous Service Medal. And what was that for? How proud of a moment was that for you?
Well, I think, you know, probably anybody who gets an Australian honour is, you know, very proud to have been nominated and to have that accepted. You don't know, of course, until very shortly before the awards are publicised or published. For me, I was actually nominated by a junior sailor that we worked with and mentored over a period of few years. And to me, that was the most important part about this honour. It didn't come from a senior officer, as they most often do. It came from a junior officer who wanted me to be recognised for the work that I'd done. Up until that point, I had been working in the gender space for Navy. I had been the inaugural Navy Women's Strategic Advisor, which essentially was the first ever gender advisor in the Australian military. That was around 2010. I'd worked in the the cultural reform space in a couple of years before that. And so she had written me up for the Conspicuous Service Cross, actually. They didn't accept it for the cross, but for the medal, which was fine.
What's the difference there, Jen?
It's just just the next level up.
Oh, right, okay, yep.
I don't know what their criteria is and how they assess these things, but she was a young junior sailor who thought, I'm going to nominate this commander, and that's quite unheard of. And so I've watched her grow over the years too. She went from being a junior sailor, now she's just about to embark on a PhD, and she's gone through everything in between. So I'm very proud of what she's achieved. But she took it upon herself, and she got some pushback and resistance from her chain of command, who said, oh no, you can't nominate a senior officer for an award. And she said, well, I'm going to. And she just, bit like me, just pushed through and wouldn't take no for an answer, and that's how I got it. So I got it for the work that I'd been doing as essentially Navy's gender advisor on gender issues within the Navy itself.
So apart from deploying to, and I guess like all service personnel, you're proud of your medals, but is that one of your proudest medals, having that on, obviously being able to deploy as well, and your Afghanistan medal and your NATO medal, but Is that a proud medal for you to have to wear on your chest?
Yeah, I think so, and I think mainly because I was nominated by a junior sailor who appreciated and valued me enough to say I should be recognised for the work that I've done, and she wasn't going to wait for some senior officer to do it.
Well, it may never have happened.
Exactly, right? And as I said, most of the senior officers I've worked with were men, and maybe that's never something that they would think of. I don't know.
Yep.
But anyway, yes, that is. But for me, actually, all my medals, with the exception of my basically my Defence Force Service Medal, I'm very proud of, because I got all of them in my 50s. So when I first joined the Navy, not even men had medals except for the old Vietnam veterans. Right? So, and it was a peacetime military. There was nothing going on in the world. Very few peacekeeping positions on UN peacekeeping missions, and so there were plenty of people walking around with no medals except for the the Long Service Medal or Defence Force Service Medal. So I thought, well, that's okay. We're all the same. No biggie. And then from about the early 1990s, when women just happened to be in the right place at the right time in terms of, for example, being on a ship or transferring to a different category or employment category, or even whatever role they were having at the time. Actually, and that because the restrictions on combat-related roles had been lifted, that also meant that women could deploy. And so, by 2000, we had women deploying to, Timor, Leste, and other places, as the first the first cadre of women to deploy overseas. And so then, from then on, you started to see men and women wearing medals from, operational deployments. And, of course, I was always jealous because, we do judge each other by what we wear on our uniform, and that's a sad reality of our worth, because I know plenty of people who've come in, maybe laterally at senior ranks, or come in from other public service organisations who may not have had a background in the military, and of course they don't have the same medals. They don't even have the Defence Force Service Medal or the Long Service Medal, right? And you kind of you judge them because you think, oh well, you haven't been through the hard yards I have as a trainee and as a young officer, and so we just do that. We look at people and say, well, we know where you've been, what you've done, what commendations you've got, and all sorts of things, what qualifications you've got. And I suppose I looked at it and just thought, well, that's never going to be me because I'm just never going to have an opportunity to deploy. I'd been out between 2003 and 2008. And thought, oh, well, I'm probably past it, like age-wise and time-wise. And so when I deployed to Afghanistan, I was actually 51. And that's where I got that. And so my medals for deploying to there, my CSM, and then because of my secondment to UN Women in New York,
we'll talk about
I got
that.
my UN medal as
right.
well. So it's never too late.
No,
right?
No, that's right. No, and because I had someone who very well. I had Sandy Colson on the podcast, and she said to me when she came on, she said, Adam, I never deployed. And she said, oh, who wants to listen to my story? And I went, but Sandy, you were part of the change. You were part, and Jen, you were too. Like before this came up, your deployments, you were part of that change. You were part of, and as Sandy said, she wanted to leave the Navy in a better place than when she first joined. And you did that as well. And it's, when Sandy said, well, I only had the 2 medals and then she got her conspicuous service medal as well. And it's, I sometimes feel that, you're right. The judgment is there, but you still, regardless of whether you deploy or not, you sign a blank check with you that you will give your life if you're called upon to defend our nation. Yeah, that's a big enough. That's a big enough ask in itself. So I think it's a funny one, isn't it? It's a real. It is interesting when you judge people by, well, hey, you haven't got those. You haven't got the, as some people says, the lolly wrappers. But they're meaningful for different reasons for different people. And you mentioned that in 2017 you were seconded to the US. How did that come about for you?
Right. So after I got back from Afghanistan in 2013, I was appointed by the Chief of Defence Force to lead the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda across the ADF and across the Department of Defence. And as part of that work, the head of the strategic commitments area at that time was Rear Admiral Trevor Jones, who's one of those officers I was talking about who I remember very fondly and think very fondly of, because he was a great officer. He was a warfare officer, but he was kind, and he certainly understood the issues around women's participation. And so he was the one that actually originally, got me into the strategic advisor's role. And then ultimately into my deployment to Afghanistan, and then as a Navy captain, and I'm working, on the Women, Peace and Security agenda. He highlighted the potential to create a secondment to the UN to work on women, peace and security. And it took, it really did take probably about 2 or 3 years for this arrangement to get put in place. The first, what he wanted to do firstly was to offer the opportunity to the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, or Peace Operations as it's known now. But for some reason they declined, but they then offered it to UN Women. And for those who don't know, UN Women is the UN entity for gender equality and women's empowerment that does the UN agency that works across peace and security efforts. So they are there in conflict countries, they are there in non-conflict countries working on gender mainstreaming and gender equality issues. But particularly they support those other UN agencies who are working in conflict environments. And they have offices, for example, in Afghanistan, they had an office there working with local NGOs and local women politicians and other public officials at that time to enable, women's progression and development, Afghan women's progression and development. And that's happening in countries all around the world. So UN Women has a big footprint. And also they're leading the work on the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And, this podcast is not long enough for me to, describe to you what that's all about, and people can Google it if they're interested. But there's a big body of work that's been undertaken by the UN and NATO in respect to its military operations in progressing that women, peace and security work. And so this secondment was created. It was initially created for 5 years. And it was the first secondment was due to occur in time for me to hand over leading the women, peace and security work in the ADF. I'd done 3 years, and I really was in fact, my view was that I was the best person for the job, because I was the only one who'd really had the experience and the training, the knowledge and the skills in women, peace and security to go over and represent the ADF in that kind of forum working on those kind of issues. So that's how the secondment came about. Now it's on its... there's another Navy commander there this year. So this would be the 4th rotation for this secondment. And apparently it's going for another 10 years.
Yeah, right.
And so it's an arrangement that obviously the ADF, along with UN Women in New York, value very highly. It gives UN Women the military experience and expertise that they don't have normally. And it has really enhanced their ability to be engaged with the security sector in various countries and in peacekeeping missions as well too. So there's been the good arrangement in terms of knowledge sharing, capability sharing, what the military brings to them and what they bring to the military. And it was really set up with the whole purpose of bringing that knowledge and experience back to the ADF in terms of the way that we were implementing women, peace and security.
So I want to touch on you mentioned in the podcast that you're a mum, and how did you balance being seconded and obviously being deployed to Afghanistan and also then being seconded to the US, being a full-time mum? How did you juggle both roles?
Yeah, so it was extremely hard because I was a single mum when the girls were about 4 and 6. And I was the primary caregiver. I was working full time, and that's why I decided I would take some time out and go to the reserves for about 5 years. And when I came back in 2008, I decided that the girls were old enough. They were both in primary school. It was time for me to come back to work full time. I felt that I could give more. And in fact, I was offered a job in the same organisational cultural reform space that I'd worked in before I'd left full-time service. So I thought, this is great, and come back into that field. And I said to my ex-husband at the time, it's now time for us to do week about in terms of care and share the load. That was fine. We did that up until I deployed to Afghanistan, when, of course, the girls had to go and live with him. So I didn't really have any other family to fall back on. When I was on my own with the girls, I used all forms of childcare and services that I could, before and after school care, nannies, babysitters, whatever I could, get my hands on. Worked remotely, worked from home, worked different hours, whatever I could do to actually still do my work. And I even still did that when I was a captain and I was leading the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security work. The Chief of Defence Force trusted me enough to do my job no matter where I was and how I was doing it. And so I was still juggling kind of hours and remote work and so on, even before remote work became fashionable with COVID. And that really, I guess, perhaps I'm going to say generosity, but it's not really the right word to use, but I guess the leadership shown by the senior male officers that I worked for over the years that I had the children, I was a single mum and trying to work and do all the things I wanted to do, allowed me to do both, to try and really be a good mum, which was my first priority, and to still do some of the career goal, meet the sort of milestones and goals that I would like to in my career. So yes, they were teenagers when they went to live with their father when I went to Afghanistan, so that was okay. And then when I posted to New York in 2016, my oldest daughter had started university, so she was staying here in Canberra. So I left her in my family home with the pets, and we just kept the family home here. And my youngest daughter came with me with the idea that she would do year 11 and 12 in the US. That didn't quite work out. My younger daughter has some mental health issues that didn't really enable her to stay in the US, and I had to bring her back to Australia. So she came back and moved in with her sister. She was 16 at the time, and my older daughter was 18, and I thought, okay, it's probably not ideal. And as it turned out, it really wasn't ideal. But, they were still old enough to be able to, and they had family support, like they, very close to my younger sister and her family. And they had friends and family friends who they could call on for support. So I wasn't worried at all about leaving them at home in Canberra and I'm in New York. I would have preferred my daughter to have been with me. But they came and visited, and I came home a couple of times as well too. So we managed it, and
But you had a job to do.
I had a job to do that I really wanted to do. And I really felt that I had so much to give in that job.
Well, I think, and sorry to cut you off. I think too, you sacrificed so much, and not that you regret sacrificing for your girls, but I think for you, having doing something for you, and like you say, you had something to offer in that role, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, Jen, either.
No, and also too, I guess I wanted to be a role model for my daughters and show them what's possible, what they can do,
absolutely,
especially in terms of career. But as it turned out, I did have to come back from that posting a little bit earlier than I wanted because just of the difficulties with the children living together and probably needing some parental support. And while I was very sad about leaving earlier than I had anticipated, I thought, well, what do? You have to be there for your children. They are the most important, thing. My greatest achievement are my children. And I'm so glad I did that. Instead of just saying, no, you deal with it, I'm staying here and, having a great life in the US, doing all this work. And I never regretted coming back early because it ultimately saved my younger daughter from some difficulties she was having. And they're now 23 and 26 years old. They're both, they've got degrees. They've got, settled down with nice partners. They've bought houses. They're, the youngest one is an EL1 in the public service. They've just got, they've done so well. And I feel that the sacrifices that I've made have enabled them to do that and to be in that place today. And I wouldn't want that to be any other way. And our relationship is close. Unlike my relationship with my own mother, which is what I had strived for, that I've achieved. And so making the sacrifices along the way for me have been worth it. And whether those sacrifices have meant, leaving a job a bit earlier or not getting promoted to the next rank, which I never really cared too much about because I actually got more satisfaction and validation from the work I was doing, it all paled into insignificance when you think about what's most important in your life.
Well, you came. So you mentioned you came back from the US a little bit early, and then you decided to call time on your full-time career in the Navy. And what made you come to that decision, Jen?
Firstly, so it's a little bit complicated. When I was doing the women, peace and security work in defence, I had been given acting rank to captain, which is colonel equivalent. I was very capable. I did the job for 3 years without any problem. And, I couldn't have got better reports from the Chief of Defence Force at the time. But I was not promoted substantively to captain. And I came back to being a substantive commander to take up the posting in New York, which of course I didn't mind either because I wasn't really going as a Navy commander. I was going more as a policy specialist to support their military and peace and security efforts. And then I realised that actually... over the years that I'd worked in the gender and women, peace and security space, that I had formed this very big international and national network of practitioners and academics, so NGOs and other government organisations and other armed forces and international organisations like the UN and NATO and various forums that I was involved with in my work in that area. And knowing that I was coming back to Canberra, and knowing that I was probably going to be posted into a job that was unrelated to this work that I really felt was my passion, I thought, and I'd done the most senior job in this area, so there was nothing to go to. I thought, well, there's nothing to keep me at all, really. There's no value in staying. I really do need to pull the pin and just continue to do the work that I'm doing, but do it just in a sort of a consultant way. And I essentially finished work on a Friday. That was my last day in the Navy, and started my first contract with UN Women in the Ukraine, actually, on the Monday.
Yeah, right.
And it hasn't stopped. And I've worked pretty much consistently for UN Women in Ukraine, Jordan, and also for the headquarters office in New York. Done a variety of things in terms of gender mainstreaming and gender, developing strategies, conducting gender audits, developing and conducting training for military women for peace operations, a whole range of things, but related to gender and gender perspective in the security sector. That's my kind of niche area. Mm-hmm. I've worked as a course author for the Peace Operations Training Institute in the US, which is a organisation that provides online training for those who are deploying to peacekeeping operations. So it kind of complements the training that you receive by the UN and NATO for your deployments or peacekeeping. So I wrote courses on gender equality and peacekeeping and preventing violence against women, and also 3 course manuals on women, peace and security. So I continued to do that sort of work as well too. All of that then kind of led me to really thinking that I'm doing all this practitioner work. Maybe I need to get a bit of academics behind me to give me, I guess, a bit more credibility as an authority in this space. So over the last 3 years, I did my Masters of International Development through the University of Canberra. That was the closest I could get to anything with sort of some form of gender and armed conflict component to it. So I completed that in November last year. And my major thesis was related to gender equality for uniformed women in peacekeeping. And I've now just started my doctoral studies looking at how women, peace and security can be engaged to enhance human security outcomes in peace operations. So I've kind of like morphed into this sort of almost academic career. Along the way, I've been writing as well too. I write for various forums and magazines, not journal articles, but not peer-reviewed journal articles, but articles for academic and non-academic forums. So I love writing, which is really what prompted me to think about doing a PhD rather than another master's or write another book.
Which we'll touch on shortly.
Yeah.
And
if you'd told me 10 years ago that I would be sitting here starting my PhD studies, I would have said, I think you're joking. Given that when I joined the Navy, I couldn't do a degree. Some years later, I could have done a degree in the Navy, but there was nothing that interested me. And it wasn't until I started my civilian work with the UN that I really started to develop this passion for the practitioner work that I was doing, and built on the work that I'd done in the ADF around gender, but really taking it to the next level.
So explain to me, Jen, with the love and passion that you found for gender equality, what is it about this work that you find so passionate and so interesting, and seeing it from different countries' perspectives? Where's the fire and the passion come from?
I just think it's for me, it's seeing women's lives changed as a result of the work that has been done, particularly by the UN, but also by NATO. Whether we're talking about Afghan women, or we're talking about women in the Ukraine. And interestingly, of course, the work I did in the Ukraine was, prior to the war that exists there at the moment. And, at that time we were doing a gender audit to examine the discriminatory practices that existed in the Ukraine Armed Forces and the police, which has actually gone on to be proven in the current circumstances, where women have complained about the uniforms and the PPE they're required to wear that's made for men and ill-fitting, and means that they can't actually do their job properly. And we're talking about women on the front line here, and they still use that term front line, which is not something that we do really. But and so for me, it was sort of just seeing that there were steps that could be taken that could change things for women to give them greater equality. It's all relative and context-driven and culturally driven. So the work I was doing in Jordan, for example, they have come a long way. They want to be the leading Arab state on gender equality for women in the security sector, and they're on their way. That certainly started their journey. They've got this gender mainstreaming strategy for both the armed forces and the police. They're working on various initiatives that will increase the numbers of women, increase the numbers, the type of roles that are open to women. They're probably 30 years behind where we are now, but that's how we started as well too. So for me, it's that my passion comes from just being a part of that change, and it goes back to being a part of the change in the ADF. So I kind of feel that
you've gone full circle.
Or I'm sort of in the same role, but not in the same role.
Yeah.
Just working for a different boss, I guess.
Yep.
And look, and also seeing the change in men. I have had seen senior male officers in the military proudly claim that they're Wittwer trained. And they've had their epiphany. And they completely understand why now it's important in a war context that you think about the gendered implications of that conflict on women and men and boys and girls and others. And that it's not just a straightforward one-size-fits-all response to everything. Even something as simple as the protection of civilians, you can't just treat everybody the same, because everybody has different needs and concerns based on their gender and other intersections that impact people's lives. So to see senior men come on board, become the allies for change, the allies for gender equality, allies who acknowledge that there's still more to be done. And I think there's more to be done here as much as I think there's more to be done, in some of the other countries that I've worked with as well too.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that's where it's like I wake up every morning, and whether it's studying or whether it's working, I get up because I love this topic. I love the people I work with. I mean, I work with international colleagues all the time. You know, we've got phone calls at odd hours, Zoom calls. I work on projects with them. I'm not just working here in isolation on my own. And I love that part of being that part of an international community on women, peace and security and gender. Again, I found my tribe.
Yeah.
So I kind of just moved from logistics to gender. But the tribe thing is so important.
Absolutely.
Like, I don't believe I would be where I am today in my consulting and in my academic journey if I didn't have that tribe as well too.
Absolutely. And a close friend of both ours, Lindsay Freeman, is another young female who's doing amazing work in this space. For you, you've worked alongside Lindsay. How is it seeing her grow and develop in the role that she's now doing?
Yeah, she's an adorable, very competent professional army officer who's also very passionate about gender equality and the women, peace and security agenda. And actually, I feel like she's me, but 20 years ago. And I'm almost a bit jealous because she's come to this earlier than I did, you know, age-wise, and I guess in terms of position and opportunity. So she's got more time to do more. I'm not sure how much more time I've got. But look, I actually quote her in my book because she was happy for me to share this story that when she first joined the army, she was like most women who join the army. I'm just fitting into this box. This, you know, the way that the army is constructed, these are the rules, this is how it is, this is how things are done, we all look the same, we all look like men, you know, all those things. And she just thought that was equality, and she was comfortable with that. And I see that in a lot of young people, young women I meet, that's exactly how they view it. They think, I'm wearing the same uniform, I'm being paid the same, I'm doing the same job, we have equality. What they don't understand is there's still some institutional challenges to being a woman in the military, and these often don't arise until circumstances change. Like they get married, start a family, take some time off, you know, that might affect their seniority or their, you know, getting a certain position or, you know, and then they start to fall behind their peers. And then they start to see that it's not as easy to be an officer in the military as it is for men. Who have had the traditional and historic advantage and privilege, as in all professions and in all industries in the world today. And so she says that it wasn't until she started her family that she kind of had this epiphany, her own epiphany, and realised that was the case, that there was going to be some disadvantage to be a woman. Women still have to bear the majority of care of children in Australian society. And, you know, military women are not immune from that, even if they're married to military men. And so there's these barriers and challenges that are silent and not talked about unless they're talked about. And so it's something like that that then drives women like Lindsay to actually become a bit more vocal in actually then saying to her peers and colleagues. So it's not just coming from me as an older person and what I've been through, but she's saying, you know, this is hurting me, right? This is difficult for me. You know, I have these challenges that men don't have. And so that's what we mean in terms of gender equality. And also too, you know, when we look at the level of violence in Australian society, violence against women, I mean, just look at the headlines we've had in the last week already. More than one woman a week this year already has been killed as a result of intimate violence, partner violence. So that in itself is a reflection of society's values and attitudes towards women and where they should be and what they should be doing and what roles they should have. And we still see this kind of sexism and discrimination every day, everywhere, not just the military, in plenty of other professions around the world.
I see it as well, and yeah, it's. You and I have spoken off air, and that's. I'll leave it at that. That's I'll leave it at that, and I'll get myself in a bit of hot water. So I'll just
But, so I guess so. That's where Lindsay's coming from now, and that's why I see her. You know, I've been mentoring her over the years. She calls me a
powerhouse.
mentor.
Yeah,
she is a powerhouse. She's a real go-getter. I've brought her along on a couple of initiatives and projects that I've been involved in that she's just taken up and run with. She's got just so much initiative. She's amazing. And I feel that probably ultimately she'll end up in a similar path to me in terms of the consulting work, because again, she's passionate about women, peace and security, and there may not necessarily be a career path for her in the military to continue to do that work. But she, like I said, I quote her in my book because she's a good example of people who've been turned around once they understand the realities of life for women in male-dominated professions.
And you're right in the sense of it's very similar to how your career was, where she's a single mum as well. She's doing exactly that. So recently, Jen, you deployed to in your consultancy work, and I call it deploy. You deployed to South Korea. What was your role over there, and what was the? How long were you over there for?
Well, there's, I guess, a little bit of backstory to this particular trip and project. But 7 or 8 years ago, UN Women in New York had developed and implemented a female military officers course as a preparatory course generally for women from global south countries to... so there's a bit of a backstory to this trip and the project. So about 7 years ago, UN Women in New York had designed and implemented a female military officers course, which was a preparatory course for women military officers from primarily global south countries to prepare them for peacekeeping, or to upskill them in ways in which they may not have been in their own national forces that would make them competitive for a deployment to peacekeeping. And it was all part of the measures that the UN was putting in place at the time to increase the numbers of women, particularly uniformed women, military and police, in peacekeeping. So it's a course that's been run for about 7 years by a small group of facilitators and was done in isolation to the training provided by their national peacekeeping centres for the normal UN pre-deployment training that they would receive, as well as specialised training on being a staff officer or a military observer in a peacekeeping mission. So they would always be done in a national peacekeeping centre. This was an international course that would be held in a peacekeeping centre in 3 select countries every year, and women would travel from their various countries to attend this course. And it was a 2-week course. It did focus a lot on conflict-related sexual violence and sort of the gendered implications of conflict. But it was designed to give them the confidence to nominate for a peacekeeping mission and to empower them to consider that they were experienced and capable and confident of deploying to a peacekeeping mission. Last year, in one of my other roles, I'm a lead associate for Gender Associations, which is a consulting firm based in Berlin. So it's very much an international consulting firm.
Yep.
So a colleague and I from Gender Associations were contracted by UN Women to do a review of the female military officers course. And we sort of determined that probably in the best interests of making it more sustainable, it did need to be delivered in a different format. It did need to refocus attention on the topics that were being delivered and to essentially to fit within the existing sort of UN training that's already provided. This subsequently led to UN Women collaborating with the Department of Peace Operations to then design a 3-week women's military peace operations course that would comprise 1 week of the UN the core pre-deployment training that all peacekeepers get when they deploy, a week of the specialised training on being a staff officer or military observer, and then a 3rd week to be on leadership, empowerment and networking. Now, the reason why these skills were considered to be important was, was born out of a lot of research and evaluation that has been done over the last few years around women's participation in peacekeeping and identifying some of those structural barriers and institutional challenges to their participation, either in even nominating to be deployed or actually being deployed and experiencing some of those challenges, such as discrimination and racism and sexism within peacekeeping environments. And so UN Women wanted an additional week to build on the UN training, but to give them the confidence that they could deal with some of the situations that would arise when they were in peacekeeping. And the reason why it's a women's only course is because essentially men don't need it. Men have held the privilege of being deployed to peacekeeping missions for a very long time. Women still only comprise around about 15%, which is quite low. Or in fact, I think it's about 9%. So it's still quite low. And so this is another initiative to upskill women themselves to be in a position where they feel they're on a level playing field with men. So we don't want to hear men saying, "Where's our course?" because they already have their course in their national peacekeeping centres and they don't need training on leadership empowerment and networking. The colleagues that I've worked with to deliver this, 2 international colleagues, and we designed a week-long module covering various elements of leadership, empowerment and networking, but building on the topics and the scenarios in the UN training. And the course in the Republic of Korea, South Korea, was for 3 weeks, and we delivered the inaugural course at that time. And it's now being conducted in Senegal in November. This is the second pilot, and a third pilot will be in Nairobi in March next year.
Wow, that's
exciting.
exciting.
And look, it was a fabulous course. We had 2 instructors from the Department of Peace Operations. We had 2 instructors from member states, and we had 2 UN Women facilitators there for the entire course. And we had 24 women from 12 Asia Pacific countries, including 1 Australian, and those women just inspired me with their boundless energy and enthusiasm and participation right up until the last day of a very long 3-week course. But again, that's what you go back to that question of what drives me and why am I so passionate about it? Seeing these women experience change across that 3 weeks, where they felt we had women in rank from young lieutenant through to colonel, so it was quite a broad range of ranks. Actually sort of understand what some of those challenges might be, and then develop the strategies that they needed to face those potential situations that might arise. And also to give them the confidence to stand up and be part of the change in the peacekeeping mission that's also necessary to make it a more safe and inclusive place for men and women together. So there's still a lot of work to be done in the sort of around the culture of peacekeeping missions, and I think the UN acknowledges that. But they're starting the journey now. And so I guess maybe a little bit of what I'm doing in my PhD studies is to kind of help to change that culture of those peacekeeping missions, so that we're thinking more about human security, not just for the population that they're deploying there to protect, but also the population within the mission, the peacekeepers themselves, and valuing everybody's contribution, everybody's gender, identity, and what they bring. So hopefully they'll, in the future there'll be change. But anyway, so that was what that training was about, and I'm looking forward to heading to Nairobi in March to deliver it again.
Absolutely. And recently, Jen, you were awarded you came back from that, and you found a really, well, a bit of a shock, I guess. You were awarded your Federation Star for 42 years of service in the Navy. And in 1981, when you first joined, did you ever think that you would get to 42 years of service? And the Federation Star, can you give a little bit of, because people, non-military people, they go, "What's a Federation Star?" But it's a big deal. Can you give us and what was that like when you received your Federation Star?
Well, first of all, I can say I don't know where all the years have gone, because I can tell you I'm still 25 in my head. Right? We all say that. you know. And actually, I really feel it. My body doesn't feel it, but my head feels it. No, when I joined, I thought I will at least do 20 years because the superannuation scheme that was in place at that time enabled you to access a pension if you had done 20 years. So you could leave and then you could access the pension. So I thought, okay, if I need to leave because I've started my family, I'll have a pension. I won't be relying on my husband. I don't want to be financially dependent on anybody. I want to be able to look after myself. So that was my first goal. To be honest, I never really sat there and thought, I'm going to do 40 years. It just happened. And it really only happened because, so after I'd completed 22 years when I first left full-time service and transferred to the reserves, and then I had 5 years off just doing reserve work. Mm-hmm. Came back in 2008 because I was offered this role back in the organisational culture space. That then led to the role as the Navy Women's Strategic Advisor, which then led to being deployed. Was working in the Navy cultural reform space again. That then led to the Gender Advisor role. That then led to deploying to Afghanistan. That then led to leading the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. That then led to New York. And it was like, there was just this next thing that kept on happening where I thought, and I'm having too much of a good time. I'm not ready to go yet. Right, I didn't need to go. I was enjoying it. The money was good. I was still a single mum, obviously, and the money was good. But I enjoyed the responsibilities. I enjoyed the roles. They were all inaugural roles that I had. So I was the first person in each of those roles. There's a lot of kudos that goes with that as well too. And it just seemed to be the next thing, the next best shiny thing came along, and I thought I want that. So I stayed. And then in 2018, when I decided to leave full-time service again, transferred back to the reserves, and I have done reserve work in the last 5 years. The first project I had for about 3 years was coordinating the annual Women in the ADF report. So I felt that was very much aligned with the work that I was doing as a consultant for the UN. And so it was great to still contribute to the ADF work that was being progressed on women's participation. And then last year I did, in the last financial year, I did a bit of work for the Australian Defence College Centre for Defence Leadership and Ethics as a gender advisor on the renewal of the leadership development program that they were putting in place as a result of the Brereton report, the changes to leadership development that were occurring at the time. So March 6th of March this year was essentially the 42-year anniversary. Now, the Federation Star, it came a bit late because actually it comes at 40 years service. So what happens is when you first join and you do 15 years, you get your Long Service Medal or your Defence Force Service Medal. And then every 5 years after that, you get this little clasp that goes on your medal to indicate a further 5 years. And then once you've hit 40 years service, you replace those clasps with one Federation Star that tells everybody that you're old.
Oh, come on, Jen, be kind to yourself.
Yeah. So, anyway, these things happen slowly, and so I just got it this year. But look, no, I never thought that I would get to the point where I would be wearing a Federation Star. It does mean I'm old. But it does recognise a long career, and of which
a
I'm very
distinguished
proud.
career too. Yeah, absolutely,
exactly.
Absolutely.
And I should be proud of it.
Yeah,
I am. I guess.
Yeah, it is, and I think it's great to look back and especially talk on podcasts and see. Yeah, it is a distinguished career, and you absolutely should be proud of what and especially entering into a time that, as you say, it was different times in the early 80s for women to come into and a different time in Australia too and I think absolutely, like, it's you have been a trailblazer for the women that have come after you, and also there's been and like you said, you had at the start of the podcast, you had no female bosses, so you had no real female mentors either. You just had to do it the Jen Wittwer way. Yeah. That was it. And
but let me clarify though, because you mentioned Sandy Coulson. Sandy, I think even from the moment I joined, she must have been a commander, because she's sort of half a generation ahead of me. Sandy and I are great mates, and I adore her. And I adored her when she was in the Navy, but she was an administration officer and not within my tribe. So not in logistics. There were no women logistics officers ahead of me. The female commanders that we had at the time were of Sandy's ilk, and they were administration officers. Or there might have been some nursing officers as well too at that time. Even before women doctors were allowed to join. So, there was this very small cohort of women officers. We knew each other, but, I never worked for her because she was never going to be in a logistics role.
Absolutely. And
so I just want to give a big shout out to Sandy because I really do adore her.
Yeah, she's a beautiful, beautiful soul and a beautiful lady. And so... Jen, what advice would you give to any young person that is thinking about joining the Navy or the Defence Force?
I would say, look, for young men and women or for non-binary and for other gender identities who are thinking that this would be a good career for them, to be aware that there would still be some challenges around the way in which the organisation works. It's a monolithic organisation that takes time to change, but that change has occurred because people have pushed it for the change and questioned it. I mean, for example, we have some great policies out now around non-binary officers, for example, who come through the Defence Force Academy, and things have had to be adjusted because of that. Now, we can no longer say, oh, well, if you want to join the military, you just have to fit in and look like us. We can't say that anymore. We have to be more adaptive to, society and to the type of people who want to, join us. Other militaries are doing it. Canada's relaxed its uniform laws, for example, to allow people to wear the uniform that their gender most identifies with. And so it can change. We can change. And I would say, though, that it's not necessarily going to be an easy ride, but just to perhaps be aware that some challenges might arise. But also to maybe particularly for the women, because we do beat ourselves up a bit more than maybe men do, just to know that they wouldn't be there if they didn't have, the requisite education or the skills or the competencies that the organisation wants, right? So they've already made it because they've been selected. They're there, right, doing their training, becoming an officer or a sailor or whatever it is that they're joined to do, whether it's to fly a plane or drive a boat or do whatever. And so I know that all young people now think, of course, every opportunity should be open to them. They should have access to resources and decision-making and power the same way that men do. And that's exactly what equality is, because equality is not about being the same. And so I would like to think that all young people who are joining today think that that's the case, right? Think that they are entitled to and should access equally, alongside men and others who might have been here longer than them, the same privileges and opportunities and postings and promotions. There still could be some hiccups along the way. But I would just say have the courage to push back and be part of the change. If there's something happening that they can't do for some reason that you feel is discriminatory or a barrier, then actually question it. Ask why. Because I would never have gotten to do what I've done if I had not said, well, why not? So don't just accept what you're told straight away. Question things. And I think young people do that anyway. When I look at my daughters, they certainly question me. So I just say, just think of it. It is a great career. It can provide really great professional opportunities, professional training. You can get so much out of it. You can learn so much about yourself. There's just sometimes some experiences that are not as positive that could occur, but there's also now, I feel, greater resources and systems in place that can support people through those difficulties.
And I think too, as you're saying, go in with your eyes wide open and know what you do, a bit of research before you go in and know what you're getting yourself into. And yeah, absolutely. I think that's great advice. And for you, looking back now, was joining the military still the best decision that you made?
Look, I honestly don't think that I would be doing what I am today without it. The only other career I wanted was to be a police officer. And actually, around about 15 years ago, I did apply to the AFP to join because I thought, they're looking for more women and, I'm in my 40s and I'm still, competent and capable. And anyway, they didn't come to fruition. And in a way, it was probably good because then I did end up coming down this path of gender and women, peace and security. I love my life now. I love what I do. I'm passionate about it. I care about it. I care about the women that I mentor and I teach and I train. I want to be part of that, doing that, not just writing policy, but I want to be in the classroom facilitating the training like I did in South Korea, touching the lives of women. That's what I feel that I was put into the Navy to do.
Absolutely.
And I feel like I've been doing that my entire career. And hopefully I've touched the lives of men as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I mean, you talk about it in your book and we'll get to that in a second, but knowing what you know now, Jen, and all you've been through, what advice would you give to your 18-year-old self, and would she listen?
Probably not. I mean, who listens when they're 18?
Exactly. Good.
I think I just would have said, no, I'm still going in with my eyes wide shut. I would just say the same thing that I've just suggested about advice to young people joining is just to be aware that all is not as it seems.
Very, very good. Very, very good advice to any young person that listens to this as well. And I guess, in a sense too, Jen, enjoy the journey. Enjoy the road. Enjoy the journey, and embrace all the good, all the bad, and learn from those experiences. And it shapes who you become.
Absolutely.
I think that's really great advice to any.
I'd like to feel that I'm a really good example of someone who has been through ups and downs, positives and negatives, come out on the other side, but also, I still feel very proud of my naval service. I feel proud of everything I've done. If I wear my medals on Anzac Day, I'm obviously very proud to be seen wearing those medals, and it means so much to me. I'm proud of the people that I've worked for, worked with, had worked for me, that I've mentored, that I've supervised, and I hope that they feel the same way about me. Look, I'm obviously very proud, and of course my parents are very proud, and my daughters are very proud that I've done so much in the Navy. I don't think I would have wanted it any other way.
Absolutely. And we've mentioned throughout the podcast your book, and so recently you published your book. And how did this come into fruition, and where can people get a copy of your book?
So actually, I'd been thinking about writing a book for a few years, and I kind of didn't get around to doing it. I mean, as an author, you've kind of had your thoughts about, why would anybody want to read my story? Because I'm just really nobody.
Yes.
Or I'm just an ordinary person maybe who's done some extraordinary things. But I wanted to share my journey in a way that would actually help others, or help change their lives, or help them do something different. And when I say others, I mean women mainly. Because the book is about helping women be their authentic selves in male-dominated professions. Because I alluded to it earlier, when we join an organisation like the military or the police or fire brigade, or even in mining industry, or even in law firms, in the law field, there are still difficulties for women joining organisations that have been historically and traditionally dominated by men. And the challenges may not be the same, but they're there and they still exist. So I thought, I've learned a lot along the way. I have tried to live by example. And for example, where I talk about taking opportunities, even when I don't know how to do it, I've done that. Richard Branson said that actually. If you're offered an opportunity, take it, even if you don't know how to do it, because you'll learn. And I feel like I applied that at least in the last 15 years of my work with the ADF. So all those sort of tips and strategies that I've used for myself to push back against the resistance to me being here initially, and then other sort of discrimination or bias or sexism that I've experienced, that I wanted to push back on. So I thought, I'm going to write a book that would actually use my story, but at the same time use it to explain the strategies and tips that I wanted to share with women. So it's a self-help book, I guess, but it's not a memoir. It's half and half, I suppose. But I also didn't want it to be a book that people would perceive to be about fixing women, because absolutely women do not need fixing at all. And, men might need a little bit of tinkering on the sides. Women don't need fixing. I say that in jest. But
I can see that.
I'm very mindful that, for a long time, women have sort of attended leadership conferences and seminars and training and all sorts of things in ways that enable them to fit in and conform to the organisation. And that's not healthy, and that's not being authentic to their own leadership style. So I wanted the book really just to share with them what I thought were some really good strategies on how to address sometimes what we impose upon ourselves, sometimes what you might experience as, systemic discrimination. Sometimes it might just be the attitudes of people in the organisation. And that's what the book became. Now, it came about because I thought, well, I could sit down and write a book, and we discussed this earlier, but where do I start? So I actually attended a writer's retreat, which got me on the path of actually structuring the book, what I wanted to put in it, what the chapters would look like, what the flow would be. And that's the best way to start writing.
Absolutely.
Because you've got some direction. You've got like a roadmap, right?
Yep,
a
absolutely.
path.
Yep.
To get from A to B. And I found the whole journey, as I'm sure you did, very cathartic. It's great to feel like you're achieving something, and ultimately it's great that you feel that the book itself might achieve something for somebody else. And we talked about this earlier where we said, it just makes a difference to one person's life.
Yep. Then it's all worth it.
Then it's all worth it, right? And so the book came out in March 2020. It was launched by Avril Henry, who had written my foreword on International Women's Day. And it has been a great resource for me to share, not only with women in the military, but women in other organisations that I have done some training with or have developed strategies for, and in some professional capacity I've shared the book. Or, of course, people just buy it, which is really great. So I have a website. It's just jenniferwittwer.com. And if you purchase the book through my website, I will personally sign and leave a message in the book for you and send it to you. But you can also buy it online at, all the usual online bookstores, amazon.com.au, amazon.com, Booktopia, Book Depository, whatever other books.
Yeah.
Even what are some of the other ones? Angus and Robertson, and some of the more mainstream bookstores online as well too.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. And so for you, Jen, what are your plans going into the future for yourself and also with your daughters?
Right. For myself, of course, I've got my PhD, which is full time for the next 3 years. I will still be doing a little bit of work with the UN because I want to stay connected to my network. And also obviously still do a little bit of work, keep my hand in. I'm hoping that I'll be able to focus primarily on the Women's Military Peace Operations course in the next few years. And where that will take me, I'm not sure. I don't know if I want to go down the academic route. I feel there's more life in the old girl yet. But I am conscious that the time will come when perhaps some of the more practical practitioner work might be best left to lovely young women like Lindsay, and where I might still contribute more from an academic perspective or an intellectual perspective. And so I hope to continue to do that, and I will continue writing, publishing articles, maybe publishing my PhD in a book, I think would be the next step after this. So unrelated to my book that I just talked about then, but more about assisting military practitioners in peacekeeping operations. So more of a textbook, I guess, kind of book.
Yep.
And then in terms of my daughters, I'm just focusing on enjoying spending time with them. I see the one here in Canberra quite a bit, the one in Perth less so. But they're, very important to me, and daily contact, phone calls and, Zoom calls and seeing each other will just continue. And so that's a big part of my life.
Absolutely.
And my pets as well too. I have a 4-year-old Labradoodle who keeps me on my toes.
she does. She's a beautiful girl. So, and Jen, I want to finish with a quote, and it's a quote. So, Jen, you have served your country with honour and brought pride to your family. Your story is one of true grit, determination, and never giving in. And there's the quote. The quote is, It's from C.S. Lewis, and I would like to finish with this because I really believe this sums you up. Courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point of life. Is full of testing times. We must just have the courage to withstand them. Thank you for your service to our country, and thank you for everything you do in raising awareness for veterans, women veteran, also veterans in general, first responders and mental health. Jen, it has been an absolute honour and a privilege to have you on True Blue Conversations and share your story. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Adam. Honestly, it's been a privilege for me to be here and share that with you and have this really great discussion. And I hope, like I do with my book, that if it touches one woman's life and helps change for her, then I've succeeded. So thank you.
Welcome, loyal listeners of True Blue Conversations. Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Australian Warfighter Coffee. Veteran owned and run, driven by a simple yet powerful motto: people over profit. Every dollar goes towards supporting veterans and first responder charity groups. Head on over to AustralianWarfighters.com and use the code TrueBlue for your exclusive discount. Because let's face it, any other coffee is just brown sadness water. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of True Blue Conversations with your host, Adam Blum. See you on the front line.